Picture a young woman named Esther Harkness standing at the bottom of the estate. Her two brothers rode off with the hall, the title, and every acre. "Enjoy your puddle, sister," her brother Julian said, and laughed. But nobody had read the old deed folded inside that cottage. What would you have done if the men who were meant to shelter you handed you a ruin and called it a kindness? Esther Harkness did not answer her brother. She only folded the deed into her sleeve, the paper still warm from the fire in the Draymore library. And she let the laugh die in the air, the way a stone lets rain run off it. Settle in with me, and let us go back to the damp lanes of Cheshire in the year 1837, to a plain village called Harrowmere, on the flat green plain where the canal runs slow and brown past the reeds. It is a story of a puddle, or so a proud man believed. Wherever you are sitting tonight, in whatever weather, tell me in the comments the name of the place you are watching from, because this story is about a place too, and about the people who decide such places are worth nothing at all. The will had been read an hour before, in the long, cold library of Draymore Hall, with the mourners still smelling of wet wool and church incense. The solicitor, a thin, dry man named Mr. Peaver, had read it in the level voice such men keep for the dividing of the dead. To my elder son Julian, the baronetcy, the hall, the home park, and the greater portion. Julian Harkness had stood by the window with his chest out and his weight back on his heels, tapping the ivory handle of his riding crop against his thigh. And he had let a small smile settle onto his broad, flushed face, as if he had won it in a fair race rather than by being born first. To my son Crispin, the eastern farms and the wood. Crispin, slighter, his light brown curls at his collar, had opened and closed his silver pocket watch and glanced sideways at Julian to see how large a smile he was permitted. And then Mr. Peaver had come to the last line, and he had read it more quietly, because he was not a cruel man, only a careful one. To my daughter Esther, Keld Lock Cottage at the foot of the estate, together with the lock and its gates, and the sum of 20 shillings a year. 20 shillings. A cottage of 2 rooms, with the damp coming up through the flags. Esther had heard it without moving. She was 22, slim and wiry, with strong forearms under the charcoal wool of her traveling dress, her dark chestnut hair pinned low at the nape and loose at the temples where the drizzle had touched it. Her deep gray-blue eyes did not fill. She had spent the last 3 winters at her father's side, out on the frozen towpath with a lantern, learning the thing no gentleman thought a daughter should learn. She had helped old Sir Bertram read the fall of the land with a brass water gauge that now hung on a cord at her waist. She knew the run of water on that estate better than any man living, and she knew, standing there in her dead father's library, that not one of them had asked her what the cottage was worth. They had only decided. It was Julian who could not let it lie. As the mourners drifted into the great hall and the servants brought the black-edged cards and the sherry, he had come to her across the flags with the crop still tapping, and he had said it loud enough for the room. "Enjoy your puddle, sister. There is a heron down there for company, and no rent to trouble you, since no man alive would pay a farthing to live in it." Some of the mourners had laughed, the soft, embarrassed laugh people give a strong man when they wish to keep his favor. And then Crispin, watching his brother's face for the cue, had added his own small knife. "Do write to us, Esther. When the frost comes and you want a bed, we shall consider it." She said nothing. That was the whole of her reply, and it was not weakness. She had learned from her father that a level does not argue with the ground. It simply shows you where the water will go, whether you like the answer or not. So she let her silence sit in the middle of their laughter like a stone in a stream, and she watched Julian's smile falter just slightly, the way a man's will when the person he has struck refuses to bleed. He tapped the crop harder. He turned away first. And that, though none of them marked it, was the first thing she took from that house that afternoon. She took very little else. One trunk, packed by her own hands, with her father's level books wrapped in oilcloth, 3 plain dresses, the brass gauge, and a loaf the cook pressed on her at the kitchen door, with her eyes down and her mouth tight, because the cook had known Esther since she was small, and dared not say so above a whisper. Then Esther walked out of Draymore Hall by the servants' door, which suited her, and she went down through the park in the failing gray light, with the rain coming sideways off the plain. How does a woman go from the warm library of a hall to a 2-room ruin beside a canal in the space of a single wet afternoon? She goes on foot, with a trunk on a borrowed handcart, and she does not look back at the lit windows. The towpath was churned mud and coal dust, black and slick, and the smell of it was the smell of the whole flat country here, wet earth and old smoke and the green rot of the reeds. Harrowmere watched her come. She passed the low brick cottages with their lamps just lit, and she saw the lace curtains move, one after another, a whole street of small, pale faces, deciding in an instant that the Harkness girl had been cast down at last, and would not last the winter, and was therefore worth a look, but not a word. No one opened a door. A child was pulled back from a step. A man mending nets by a barge turned his shoulder to her, not unkindly, only certain. The lock-keeper's cottage stood a full mile below the last house, where the estate ground fell away to the water and the canal. The Draymore cut, went black and straight into the dusk. She saw it first from the bend in the towpath, silhouetted against a bruised and yellow-gray sky, and she stopped the handcart and simply looked. The roofline sagged in the middle like the spine of a starved animal. Ivy had climbed the whole of the western gable and was prying at the mortar with its slow, patient fingers, pulling the stones apart a hair at a time. 2 of the small windows were stuffed with gray rags where the glass had gone, and they looked out at her like blind and clouded eyes. The chimney leaned, and something dark and ragged, an old nest, choked its throat. A single door hung crooked on its hinges. There was no light in it, no smoke, no sound but the water sliding through the ruined lock gates below with a low and endless mutter. It was not a house. It was a ghost. It was the ghost of a house, standing over its own drowned reflection in the canal, waiting at the foot of the estate for someone who could no longer be turned away. Esther Harkness picked up the handles of the cart, and she walked down to it through the last of the light. The door would not open at first. She set her shoulder to it, and it gave with a shudder and a shower of grit, and the smell came out to meet her before she could see anything at all. Cold ash first, from a grate that had not been lit in a generation. Then damp plaster, that soft, chalky smell of walls going back to earth. Then something older underneath, mineral and clean, that she could not name and did not stop to try. She stood in the doorway with the gray light behind her, and let her eyes find the shapes. 2 rooms, as the will had said. A front room with a broken table and a hearth choked with fallen soot. A back room beyond, darker, with a cupboard built into the wall and a floor of good stone flags under the litter of 30 forgotten years. She did not weep, and she did not curse the house, and she did not think of her brothers at all. She thought of the fire. A person can live in one corner of one room, her father used to say, so long as that corner is dry and there is a flame in it. So she cleared a single corner of the front room by the hearth, sweeping the fallen plaster and the mouse-gnawed rushes back with the side of her boot, until she had a square of clean flag the size of a hearthrug. She found the nest in the chimney was old and empty, and she pulled down what she could reach with the poker, and she built a small, careful fire of the driest splinters from the broken table, and she struck her father's flint over it until the first thread of smoke drew up the flue and did not come back into the room. When the flame caught and stood up bright, she sat back on her heels and let it warm her chapped hands. And for the first time that whole long day, something in her chest loosened. It was a very small victory. The silence of the house around that one flame was enormous. She slept by it, wrapped in the brown wool shawl and her father's oilcloth. And she woke, stiff and cold, in a gray light, with the sound of water still muttering below. In the morning, she surveyed her inheritance the way her father had taught her to survey anything, which is to say, slowly, and from the ground up, believing nothing until she had touched it. She went out to the lock first, because the lock was the reason the cottage stood there at all. The two great balance beams that swung the gates were soft with rock at the tips, and one had a green fur of moss along its length. But when she dug her thumbnail into the oak below the rot, she found the timber sound and hard as iron a half-inch down. Good oak, choked with neglect, but not dead. The lock chamber itself was half silted, a slick black sludge risen almost to the lower sill, so that the water backed and slid over the top of the gates instead of passing through them as it should. She stood on the coping stone and read the fall of it with her eye, the way the level in her mind laid a straight line across the crooked scene, and she understood in a few minutes what 30 years of gentlemen passing on the far bank had never troubled to see. The lock was not ruined. It was only clogged. It wanted a strong back and a week of work, and it would swing and hold. It was while she stood there that the dog found her. A thin old lurcher, gray about the muzzle, ribs showing under a rough, brindled coat, came out of the reeds and sat down a little way off and looked at her with the frank, tired patience of an animal that has decided something. She had a heel of the cook's loaf in her apron pocket, and she broke it and held it out. And the dog came and took it gently, and then lay down against the warm stone in the sun. And that was the whole of the negotiation. She called it Bib, for the white patch at its throat, and Bib followed her back to the fire and lay by it as though it had lain there every night of its life. That first week, she learned what her inheritance truly was, and it was not a puddle. On the third morning, a barge came down from the coal fields, low and heavy in the water, bound up the cut for the hall's own cellars and the estate lime kilns. It nosed up to a ruined lock and could go no further, because the gates would not pass it, and the boatman, a broad, stocky man with wind-reddened skin and coarse black hair going gray at the temples, stood in the stern and looked at the silted chamber and then at her, and said only, "You the new keeper, then?" Not a question. She said she was, and she saw, all at once and with a cold, clear certainty, the thing her brothers had not seen. Every barge of coal, every load of lime and timber and slate that reached Draymore Hall came up this one narrow throat of water. Every drop of it had to pass through her gate. She held the door of the whole estate, and it opened onto a puddle only if you did not understand water. The boatman was Ambrose Teal. He said little that first day, only that the gate could be hung again if she had a mind to it, and that he had a coil of tarred rope and a strong arm going spare while the barge waited. He did not offer it as charity, which she could not have taken, but as a thing that plainly needed doing while a man was standing idle. Together, over 2 long days, they lifted the sound lower gate back onto its pintle and packed the leaking sill with clay. And when the water finally rose true in the chamber, and the gate swung sweet and slow under her hand, Ambrose looked at it and grunted and said it would do, and left a half loaf of his own dark bread on the coping stone as he took his barge up through. He did not say the bread was for her. He simply forgot it there on purpose and went on his way. The village was slower. When she walked up to Harrowmere for flour and nails, the shopkeeper, a narrow man named Mr. Dwerryhouse, weighed out her flour with his eyes on the scale and would not meet her look, and gave her the price in a flat voice, as if she were already a debt he expected never to collect. And on her way down again she met Crispin, riding along the top of the towpath on a grey hunter, come down expressly to see her brought low. He reined in above her and opened his silver watch and shut it, and said, with a thin smile, "You look tired, Esther. It is only October. Do think of us at Christmas, when the frost is in those walls, and there is no man to keep you." She let him say it. She stood in the mud below him with her flour on her hip and her chin level, and she said nothing at all. And after a moment, his horse grew restless under the weight of her silence, and he wheeled it and rode back up to the hall. She was in the churchyard the next evening, taking the short way past the leaning stones, when the old woman stopped her. Griselda Coe was small, and bent almost double over a blackthorn stick, her thin silver hair under a black knitted bonnet, her pale gray eyes clouded at the edges, a bundle of dried reeds in one age-freckled hand. She came out from behind the yew as though she had been waiting, and she put the end of the stick lightly against Esther's path, so that Esther stopped. "Water goes where it's told, girl," the old woman said. Her voice was dry as the reeds she carried, "and it was told where to go a long time ago, by someone your betters would not listen to." She looked up at Esther then, one clear moment through the clouded gray. "Mind you listen better than they did." Then she took her stick from the path and turned, and went away between the stones with her slow, deliberate steps, and would say no more. Esther carried those words down the dark towpath and into her cold 2 rooms, and she turned them over as she worked, the way you turn a strange coin to read the far side. Water goes where it's told. She thought she knew what water was. She had spent days now clearing the silt from the lock chamber, hauling the black sludge out bucket by bucket until her shoulders burned and her hands were raw inside her gloves. And each day the water ran a little truer through her gates. She thought the old woman meant only the canal, the obvious water, the brown, tamed water of the cut. She did not yet understand that Griselda Coe had told her exactly what the cottage hid, in one plain sentence, and walked away. Let me stop the story here for one moment and ask you, honestly, if you had been Esther, cast down to a ruin at the bottom of your own family's land, mocked in the shop and on the towpath, and told to come begging at Christmas, would you have stayed and cleared the silt with your own 2 hands? Or would you have swallowed your pride and gone back up to the hall to ask for that bed? Tell me below what you would have done. And if you want to see how it turns out for her, follow along, because from here, it turns fast. Now, back to the cottage, and to the thing on the wall that would not let her be. It was in the back room, the dark one with the built-in cupboard, that the anomaly first caught her. She had gone in with a rushlight to see whether the cupboard might be made to hold her flour and her few plates, and when she opened its warped door and held the light inside, she stopped. The whole of that little house was furred with 30 years of dust and cobweb, and a slow gray bloom of damp. But the back of the cupboard, one panel of old oak boarding, was clean. Not wiped recently clean, but clean the way a thing is clean when the dust has simply never settled on it, because no dust in the room could reach it. She ran her fingers down it, and they came away gray at the edges and clean in the center. and the hair on her arms stood up, and she did not know why. She knocked on it. It gave back a hollow sound, a drum note, not the dead thud of stone. And when she held the rushlight close, its flame leaned steadily toward a hairline gap at the panel's edge, drawn by a cold, clean draft that came out of a wall that had solid estate ground behind it, where no draft had any business to be. Her training answered before her fear could. She took the light along the wall an arm's length either side, and there, where the plaster had fallen away near the floor, she saw the mortar between the stones. And it was wrong. For most of the wall it was the dark, crumbling lime of the 1700s, soft as cheese under a nail. But in one patch, a patch as wide as a door and running from the flags to shoulder height, the mortar was a paler gray, harder, a newer lime, laid with care by someone who knew the work. Somebody had walled up a doorway here, neatly, and hidden the join behind a cupboard, and left one panel clean because the air moving through the gap had kept it so. She wanted to open it that hour. She did not. Survival came first, her father's voice said. Always the roof and the fire and the bread before the mystery. And so she made herself close the cupboard and go back to the lock and the silt and the gates. But the pale mortar nagged at her through the whole of that fortnight, a splinter under the skin of her days. And through that fortnight, the village began, grudgingly, to change its mind about her. She reopened the lock fully, dredged it clean to the sill, greased the paddles and trued the gates so that the water passed through sweet and quick, and the boats that had crept and grounded and cursed at her throat for years now came through on the tide of it, on time, without wetting their coal. Ambrose spread the word in his flat way that the new keeper at Keld kept a better lock than the old man had these 10 years past. A carter tipped his hat to her on the towpath. The baker's wife, meeting her in the lane, pressed a warm bun into her hand and hurried off before she could be thanked, which was Haramir's own particular way of admitting it had been wrong. But if Esther prospered at the lock, the hall began, quietly, to feel the pinch of her. For the coal came up through her gate now, and the lime, and the good oak timber for Julian's new stables, and every barrel and beam of it passed under her hand and moved when she let the water move it. She was never anything but fair. She passed every boat that came and asked no toll, and served the hall as she served the humblest reed cutter's punt. But a thing you have always had for free, and suddenly hold only by the goodwill of a sister you have wronged, sits ill in the stomach of a proud man. Julian sent a boy down with a curt note about a delayed delivery of slate, and Esther sent the boy back with word that the slate had passed at noon exactly, and the boy, going up, told everyone in the shop that Miss Harkness ran her lock like a clock, and answered a baronet like a bargeman. At last, on a still, cold night with Bib asleep by the fire and the lock quiet, she could bear the pale mortar no longer. She took her fire poker and an old chisel Ambrose had left her, and she went into the back room, and she began to open the wall. It was long, hard, hurting work. The new lime was good lime, and it did not want to give. She chipped at the joints by rushlight for hours, working the poker into each seam and levering, and the mortar came away in dust and crumbs and then in small, sharp lumps, and her hands blistered inside her gloves, and then the blisters broke, and still she worked. Because a thing that is hidden as carefully as this is hidden for a reason, and she meant to know the reason. It was past midnight when the first stone rocked loose. She worked it out and set it down, and reached into the black gap beyond, and felt not the cold slime of a buried drain or a grave, which some small frightened part of her had dreaded, but dry air. Dry, still, clean air. moving softly against her raw hand, cool and mineral and old. Rot means neglect, her father used to say. Where a thing is dry, someone has taken pains, and no one takes pains to keep a nothing dry. She widened the gap stone by stone until she could hold the rushlight through, and she put her face to the gap and looked in. It was not a tomb. It was a small, dry chamber, no bigger than a pantry, lined with slate to keep the wet out, and along its shelves, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff and brown with age, lay bundles. She reached in with both hands and lifted the nearest one out into the light and unwound the cloth on the cottage floor with her heart going hard. And there, in her lap, were books. Level books. The long, narrow ledgers a surveyor carries, their columns filled edge to edge in a fine, steady hand. Page after page of figures and small, careful sketches of the lie of the land. Beneath them, rolled and tied, were survey drawings, whole maps of the country she stood in, the estate and the canal and the plain, drawn to scale with a draftsman's love. And beneath those, journals, 3 of them, bound in worn calf, written in the same fine hand, a woman's hand, close and confident and quick. The name was on the flyleaf of the first journal, written large, Adah Sorrel. Her surveys and observations, being kept at Keldlock Cottage in the parish of Harrowmere, begun in the year 1794. Esther sat on the cold flags, with bib pressed warm against her side, and read by the guttering rushlight until the light failed, and she lit another. And she forgot the cold, and the hour, and the ache in her hands. Adah Sorrel had been a hydraulic engineer, though no man of her day would have granted her the name. She had lived in this cottage more than 40 years before, when the Draymore cut was first being dug. And she had surveyed the whole scheme, and she had found something the gentleman who dug it had got wrong. In her own hand, halfway through the second journal, Esther found the passage that stopped her breath. "They will not hear me," Adah had written, in the level anger of a person long past shouting. "I have shown Mr. Braithwaite the levels 3 times over. The cut cannot be fed from the summit pond, as they insist, for the summit pond is dry by August, and I have the figures of 7 summers to prove it. The true feeder, the only sure water on this whole line, is the spring that rises in the ground behind this very cottage, in the little croft at Keld, and runs down unseen to fill the pound below. I have traced it, I have gauged it, I have proved it upon the ground with my own instruments. The whole navigation drinks from Keld and does not know it. But because I am what I am, and wear what I wear, they smile at me, and build it their way. And when their summit pond fails them in a dry year, they will send men out with spades to look for the reason, and the reason will be under my window, where they refused to look." And she had been right. Folded into the back of the third journal, sealed with wax gone dark and brittle, Esther found a legal deed, drawn up in proper form and witnessed, and a letter with it. The deed was old, older than Adah herself, made when the croft and the spring and the cottage were first parceled out, and it set down in the plain iron language of the law the thing that Adah had proved with her instruments. The feeder and all its waters, the deed said, are appurtenant to Keld Loch and to no other tenement forever. The water that filled the whole canal, the water that floated every barge to Draymore Hall, belonged in law to the ground behind this cottage, to Keld Loch, to whoever held the puddle at the bottom of the estate. The letter was addressed, in Adah's fine hand, to whoever comes after me and has the wit to open this wall. If you have found this, Adah had written, then you are as I was, put here at the foot of the world and told you are worth nothing. They gave me this cottage to be rid of me, as I think they have given it to you. But I have left you the truth of the water, sealed dry against the damp and the fools, and the deed that goes with it. Do not sell it to them cheap in your first hungry winter. Hold it. The water goes where it is told, and it was told, long ago, to come to Keld. Be its keeper, and you will never be poor in the ways that matter, whatever they say of you in the village. I could not make them listen. Perhaps you can make them see. Esther understood then, all at once, the full shape of what she held, and it was so large and so quiet that she had to set the letter down on her knee and put her hand flat on the cold flag to steady herself. The smallest inheritance on the whole estate, the 2 damp rooms and the puddle they had laughed her into, secretly held the whole of it by the throat. Julian's title and hall, Crispin's farms, every acre and every barge, all of it floated on water that in law was hers. They had given her, thinking it an insult, the one key that opened everything. She did not sleep that night, and as if the sky itself had been waiting for her to understand, the weather broke before dawn. It came out of the west across the flat plain with nothing to break it, a great autumn storm, and it fell on Harrowmere in the black hour before morning. The wind rose first, and found every rag-stuffed window and every gap in the crooked door, and Esther went round the cottage jamming what she could into the worst of them. Then the rain came, not falling so much as driven, flat and hard against the western gable, where the ivy had loosened the stones, and she heard the mortar she had not yet mended begin to run and trickle inside the wall. The cut rose fast, brown and angry, licking at the coping of her lock, and she went out into it with a lantern and Bib barking at her heel, and dropped the paddles to let the flood race through rather than back up and burst her gates, working the beams with the rain flaying her face and the water to her knees on the towpath. And then, above her in the dark, near the ridge of the roof, she heard the sound every keeper of an old house dreads. A slow, tearing groan, and a crack, and a slither, and a whole section of the sagging roof over the back room let go and came down inward, slates and rotten laths, and a black rush of water pouring in where the beams had held for 40 years. Weeks of her work, the swept rooms, the dried plaster, the small, safe world she had built in one corner, undone in the space of a breath. She stood in the yard in the streaming dark and watched her shelter open itself to the storm. It was then, over the roar of it, that she heard the knocking, not the wind, a fist on the crooked front door, and a voice, thin and frightened, calling out. She went and hauled the door open against the wind, and there on her step, drenched and shaking, stood a man and a woman she had never seen, the man supporting the woman, both of them white with cold. A small handcart tipped and abandoned on the flooded towpath behind them. They had been walking the towpath to the next parish, the man gasped, when the water took the path from under them, and their lantern had drowned, and they had seen her light, and please, for the love of God, might they come in out of it. Esther did not weigh it. She did not think, my roof is down and my fire is small, and I have 1 loaf left and half a candle. She thought only that there were 2 people perishing on her step, and that she had a fire, however small, and a corner that was still dry, and that this was what a house was for. She pulled them in. She sat them by her little hearth in the one dry corner and built the fire up with the last of her dry wood, and she took the brown wool shawl from her own shoulders and the oilcloth from her own bed and wrapped them in it. And she broke her last loaf, the whole of it, and gave it to them, and set water to boil for something warm. The woman wept with the cold and the fright of it, and the man could not stop thanking her. And Esther only knelt and fed the fire, and told them they were safe now, and that the worst of a night like this is only ever the middle of it, and that morning always comes. Her own blankets went to strangers, her own bread, her own dry corner she gave away, and sat the rest of the night on the wet flags with Bib against her, tending the flame, while the storm spent itself on the ruin of her roof. Adah Sorrel had written of holding the truth against a hungry winter. But there is a keeping that is larger than that, and Esther passed its test that night without once knowing she was being tried. She was not an owner hoarding a dry corner. She was a keeper, and a keeper opens the door. Gray dawn came, as she had promised it would, thin and cold and still, the storm blown out to the eastern edge of the plain. The couple slept at last by the embers, warm and breathing. The back room was a wreck of fallen slate and standing water, but the front room held, and the fire held, and the lock, when she went out to it stiff and gray-faced in the first light, had come through, her dropped paddles having let the worst of the flood pass without bursting the gates. She was standing on the coping, surveying the damage, when Ambrose Teal came along the sodden towpath with his coil of rope on his shoulder and two other boatmen behind him, come down of their own accord to see whether the new keeper had drowned in the night, and finding her alive, set to at once bailing the flooded lock chamber and hauling the fallen slate without being asked, as though half the parish had privately decided that the girl at Keld was one of their own now, and her trouble was theirs. Word of the night went up the towpath faster than any barge. The couple she had sheltered told it in the next parish, that the keeper at Keld Lock had given strangers her own bread and her own blankets and her own roof in the worst storm in 20 years, and asked nothing. And Ambrose told it in Harrowmere, and the baker's wife told it in the shop, and Mr. Dwerryhouse, the shopkeeper, who had weighed her flour with his eyes down, found himself the following week weighing it with his eyes up, and asking, gruffly, whether the roof was mended yet, and might he send his boy down with a load of thatch. But the greater reckoning came from the papers in the wall. Esther had written, careful and plain, to an honest canal surveyor in Chester, a Mr. Halloran, with no interest in the Harkness family either way, and had sent him one of Adah's level books and a copy of the old deed. He came out on a hard, bright morning in the first week of December, a spare, gray, methodical man, and he walked the ground behind the cottage with his own instruments, and he found the spring exactly where Adah Sorrel had drawn it 40 years before, rising quiet and steady in the little croft at Keld, and running down unseen to feed the pound below. He gauged it, as she had, and he checked her figures against the ground, and at the end of the day he folded his instrument and looked at Esther with a new and careful respect and said, "She was right, your Miss Sorrel. Right to the inch. This spring is the making of the whole navigation. And by this deed the water is yours in law. And there is not a court in England would say otherwise." He said it plainly, the way honest men say large things. And a solicitor from the same town, reading the deed over, said the same in drier words. "The feeder and all its waters are appurtenance to Keld Loch, and to no other tenement forever." It would hold. It had always held. No one had simply thought to read it. Julian came down himself when the news reached the hall, as she had known he would. He came on foot along the towpath in his bottle-green coat and his polished riding boots, with Crispin a pace behind opening and shutting his silver watch. And he stood in the yard of the ruin he had laughed at, before the mended door and the drying papers, and the plain gray surveyor packing his instruments. And Esther watched the understanding come into his broad, flushed face. That the coal in his cellar, and the lime in his kilns, and the slate on his new stables, had all come up through her gate, that the water that floated them was hers, that the puddle he had given his sister to be rid of her held the whole of Draymore in its quiet hand, and had done since before either of them was born. He opened his mouth. The riding crop hung slack at his side, forgotten, and whatever he had meant to say, he could not find it, because there was no argument in it to make, only a truth standing there in the winter light that he could not shout down or ride past. He shut his mouth. He looked at her once, and it was not a look she had ever had from him before. Then he turned and walked back up the towpath toward the hall, and Crispin, glancing between them for a cue and finding none, snapped his watch shut and hurried after him. Not a word was raised. None needed to be. They expected her to sell it to them then, at whatever price, to close her hand on the fortune and be rich and gone. She did not. She thought of Adah's letter, "Do not sell it to them cheap," and of a keeping larger than money, and she made her choice. And it was the same choice the woman in the wall had made before her, only this time it was not sealed up to wait. She kept the deed and the papers. She held the water. But she never once damned it against them, or charged the hall a farthing more than the reed cutter's punt. She let the boats keep moving, all of them, fairly and on time, because that was what the water was for, and because she found she did not want to own Draymore. She only wanted the puddle no one else could see the worth of, and the work of keeping it true. A year on, the cottage was whole. Not grand, it would never be grand, but whole enough to live and work in. The roof was thatched sound over both rooms, the western gable repointed with good pale lime by Esther's own hand, the windows glazed with real leaded glass. Ambrose found her cheap in a yard in Chester. The lock swung sweet and held true through every season, and the boats came up through Keld on time and blessed the keeper for it. On the front room wall, in a plain frame she had made herself, hung one of Adah Sorrell's survey drawings, the fine, clean map of the water no man would look at, so that the name of the woman who had proved the truth and been laughed at for it should hang in the light at last, in the house she had kept it safe in. And the village that had watched her come down that towpath in the rain, certain she would be begging by Christmas, now met her by name. "Miss Harkness," the baker's wife said, warm as bread. "Morning, keeper," the carters called from the water. They had given her, without any ceremony and without ever quite deciding to, the only title that had ever meant anything on that ground: Keeper of Keld Loch. She was standing on the coping one still gold evening, watching Ambrose bring a laden barge up through her gate, the water rising slow and true in the chamber, and lifting the boat as gently as a hand, when he looked up at her from the stern and said what half the parish had wondered aloud and never asked: that it was a strange thing, was it not, that the greatest thing on the whole estate should have come to the least of the three of them, to the one they threw away. Esther watched the water carry the boat up level with her feet. "They didn't leave me a puddle, Ambrose," she said. "They left me the key." And she said no more, and did not explain it, and turned to lean her weight on the beam and swing the upper gate wide to let him through. She keeps a heron, too, in the end, just as Julian promised her. And I will leave you with that, because it is a small, true thing, and it is hers. There is an old gray heron that fishes the pound above the loch at dawn, and Esther Harkness, keeper of Keld, leaves it a fish on the coping stone some mornings when the catch is good, the way a woman leaves bread for a neighbor, because a keeper feeds what shares her water. and because she was once thrown down to the bottom of the world herself, and knows the worth of the things men overlook. That was the story of a young woman given a ruin to break her, who found in its walls the life's work of another woman the world had thrown away, and chose to tend it rather than sell it. If it moved you, leave a like so more people find their way down the towpath to Keld. And before you go, tell me this in the comments, and think about it a moment before you answer. What forgotten thing in your own life, some skill, some place, some person the world has decided is worth nothing, is only waiting for you to look closer and read the deed and keep it? I would truly like to know. Take care of yourself, and I will see you at the next lock, when the water is high and there is another door about to open.